Good morning, common people. There are a lot of speeches these days. I'll give a speech again this time. Well, we lit present. The 32th topic we offer is confronting 2016 and 2020 polling limitations. The 2016 and 2020 elections raised questions about the state of public opinion polling. Some of the criticism was premature or overheated, considering that polling ultimately got key contours of the 2020 election correct, e.g., the Electoral College and national popular vote winner, Democrats taking control of the Senate. But the consistency with which most poll results differed from those election outcomes is undeniable. Looking at final estimates of the outcome of the 2020 U.S. presidential race, 93% of national polls overstated the Democratic candidate's support among voters, while nearly as many, 88%, did so in 2016.1. A forthcoming report from the American Association for Public Opinion Research, AAPOR, will offer a comprehensive, industry-wide look at the performance of pre-election polls in 2020. But individual polling organizations are also working to understand why polls have underestimated GOP support and what adjustments may be in order. Pew Research Center is among the organizations examining its survey processes. The center does not predict election results, nor does it apply the likely voter modeling needed to facilitate such predictions. Instead, our focus is public opinion broadly defined, among non-voters and voters alike, and mostly on topics other than elections. Even so, presidential elections and how polls fare in covering them can be informative. As an analysis discussed, if recent election polling problems stem from flawed likely voter models, then non-election polls may be fine. If, however, the problem is fewer Republicans, or certain types of Republicans participating in surveys, that could have implications for the field more broadly. This report summarizes new research into the data quality of Pew Research Center's U.S. polling. It builds on prior studies that have benchmarked the center's data against authoritative estimates for non-electoral topics like smoking rates, employment rates, or health care coverage. As context, the center conducts surveys using its online panel, the American Trends Panel, ATP. The ATP is recruited offline via random national sampling of residential addresses. Each survey is statistically adjusted to match national estimates for political party identification and registered voter status, in addition to demographics and other benchmarks. Point 2. The analysis in this report probes whether the ATP is in any way underrepresenting Republicans, either by recruiting too few into the panel by losing Republicans at a higher rate. Among the key findings, adults joining the ATP in recent years are less Republican than those joining in earlier years. The raw, unweighted share of new ATP recruits identifying as Republican or leaning Republican was 45% in 2015, 40% in the 2018, and 38% in the 2020. This trend could reflect real-world change in participation, i.e., Republicans are increasingly resistant to polling, or real-world change in party affiliation, i.e., that there is a decline in the share of the public identifying as Republican. But it might also reflect methodological changes over time in how the ATP is recruited. Switching from telephone-based recruitment to address-based recruitment in 2018 may have been a factor. Regardless of the causes, more weighting correction was needed in 2020 than 2014, when the panel was created to make sure that Republicans and Democrats were represented proportional to their estimated share of the population. Point 3. Donald Trump voters were somewhat more likely than others to leave the panel, stop taking surveys, since 2016, though this is explained by their demographics. The overall retention rate of panelists on the ATP is quite high, as 78% of respondents in 2016 were still taking surveys in 2020. But a higher share of 2016 Trump voters, 22%, than Hillary Clinton or third-party voters, 19%, stopped participating in the ATP during the subsequent 4 years. The demographic makeup of 2016 Trump voters basically explains this difference. In analysis controlling for voters' age, the race and education level, presidential vote preference does not help predict whether later they decided to leave the panel. People living in the country's most and least pro-Trump areas were somewhat less likely than others to join the panel in 2020. Researchers cannot know for sure whether someone is a Republican or Democrat based simply on their address, but election results in their voting precinct provide some insight. Analysis of addresses sampled for panel recruitment in 2020 found that households in the country's most pro- and most anti-Trump areas were somewhat less likely to join the ATP than households in more politically balanced areas. The share of sampled households joining the ATP was 9% in the country's most pro-Trump precincts, 8% in the country's most anti-Trump precincts, and 11% in the remainder of the country. While these differences are not large, they are statistically significant. Taken together, these findings suggest that achieving proper representation of Republicans is more difficult than it used to be. Survey participation has long been linked to individuals' levels of education and social trust. Now that the GOP is doing better attracting voters with lower levels of education and, according to some analysts, doing better than in the past attracting low-trust adults, Republican participation in surveys is waning, increasing reliance on weighting as a corrective. One silver lining is that these effects do not appear to be particularly large, at least at present, on the ATP. The differences between Republicans and Democrats' rates of ATP participation tend to be a percentage point or two, only marginally significant in statistical testing. It seems possible for pollsters to close the gap, to increase Republicans' participation to be more on par with Democrats, by modifying the way surveys are conducted. Based on this research, Pew Research Center is implementing a number of new strategies to improve the representation of its survey panel. Retiring overrepresented panelists. Researchers identified a set of panelists who are demographically overrepresented on the ATP and who, because of their demographic characteristics, contributed to the overstatement of Democratic support in the 2016 and 2020 elections. Later in spring 2021, the center is retiring a subset of these panelists, removing them from the panel. About 2,500 panelists out of about 13,500 total will be retired. More details about the retirement process can be found in Appendix B. Calibrating the political balance of the ATP using a relatively high response rate survey offering mail and online response. Effective January 2021, each ATP survey is being weighted to the partisan distribution from the Center's National Public Opinion Reference Survey (NPORS), which is a new annual survey using address-based sampling and offering mail or online response. The inaugural NPORS in 2020 had a 29% response rate and over 4,000 completions, most of which were by mail. 4. Testing an offline response mode. Part of the challenge with achieving robust representation of certain groups, e.g., from older, rural conservatives, on the ATP is that panelists must take surveys online. While the center provides tablets and data plans to those without home internet, not everyone wants to be online. This spring the center is fielding an experiment to determine whether it may be viable to allow panelists to respond over the phone by calling in to a toll-free number and taking a recorded survey, known as inbound interactive voice response. Respondents receive $10 for completing the call-in survey. Those preferring to answer online can still do so. Impaneling adults who prefer mail to online surveys. Prior center work has found that people who respond to an initial survey by mail, instead of online, are very difficult to recruit to the ATP, which is all done online. While such adults are hard to impanel, their inclusion would help with representation of older, less wealthy and less educated Americans. In early 2021, the center fielded a special recruitment of adults who responded to a center survey by mail in 2020. The recruitment used priority mailing and a $10 pre-incentive to motivate joining. The recruitment yielded several hundred new panelists. Developing new recruitment materials. Researchers are retooling the ATP recruitment materials with an eye toward using more accessible language and more compelling arguments for why people should join. Starting in 2021, the center is sending sampled households a color, trifold brochure about the ATP in addition to the normal cover letter and $2 pre-incentive. The center is also creating a short video explaining the ATP and why those who have been selected to participate should join. One question raised by this multifaceted strategy is whether it might overcorrect for the initial challenge and result in an overrepresentation of Republicans. While that is a possibility, we feel that the risks from too little action are greater. The center's analysis pointed to two issues: partisan differences in willingness to join the ATP and in likelihood of dropping out of the panel. In turn, the panel waiting was needing to do an inordinate amount of work to compensate for differences between the panel and the U.S. adult population. The action plan described above speaks to both issues, but only with an eye toward truing things up, not blindly going beyond. Several of the steps are exploratory, determining if and how a design change might improve the panel. Depending on the testing results, such steps, e.g., offering inbound IVR as a supplemental mode, may or may not ultimately be implemented on the ATP. Moreover, steps such as exploring an offline response mode or modifying recruitment materials are expected to improve representation among several harder-to-reach segments of society, not simply supporters of one candidate. A final question is whether such actions are necessary. Indeed, a recent center analysis found that errors in election estimates of the magnitude seen in the 2020 election have very minor consequences for attitudinal, mass opinion estimates, e.g., views on a government guarantee of healthcare or perceptions of the impact of immigrants on the country. That simulation-based analysis, while helpful for scoping the scale of the issue, does not speak to the erosion of trust in polling and certainly doesn't negate pollsters' obligation to make their surveys as accurate as possible. Even if the steps outlined above yield relatively small effects, we expect that they will improve the data quality in center surveys. Thank you.